Hello, I'm here today to talk about the WorkflowHub, a community framework for enabling scientific workflow research and development. This is a collaborative project between the University of Southern California and the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm Rafael Ferreira Silva, and I'll be introducing this work for you in the next minutes. Not surprisingly, Workflows has supported so many breakthrough research in the last years, and it continues to grow up and having more and more domains. Almost, I would say, virtually all science domains today use workflow systems and workflows to improve their research. And so the side effects of that is scientific workflows, are becoming more and more complex and require more and more sophisticated management capabilities. At the other side, you see workflows are requiring analyzing terabyte scale data sets, can be composed of millions of individual tasks that execute for just a few seconds to several hours and runs on different kind of resources, CPUs, GPUs, and so on, different kinds of memories, NV runs, for example. And what is a challenge also is to capturing these workflow features, requires that the workflow systems research and development at different levels. Everything that comes from the algorithms down to the systems and to the user interfaces. So based on this motivation, we try to look it up what is the state of the art today to doing workflow research and development. The most traditional way to do these tests and evaluations and evolving these workflow systems is to use full-fledged software stacks. Using these stacks are interesting because you have realistic executions of workflow systems and systems, but at the same time, there is a drawback when you have to figure out the configuration of the stack of systems, of softwares. Sometimes you have updates. You are limited to what is currently available. You also have the limitations of energy consumptions, cost consumptions, and so on. So an alternative to using this traditional approach of full-fledged software stacks is to use simulation. So that is, the idea is to implement and use a software artifact that can model functional and performance behaviors of these software stacks. And by simulations, you can, in a controlled environment, you can simulate what is close to the reality of the software stacks. There are very nice simulator tools today that provide very accurate models. And also, you can simulate scenarios that doesn't exist. For example, the upcoming exascale system. So here it comes what we call the WorkflowHub. There is a community framework that provides a collection of tools that we can analyze traces, create synthetic workflow traces, and simulate workflow executions. So on the figure on this slide shows you what is the concept. So basically, when you see on these dashed lines here, is what a typical workflow execution happens. You have a production workflow system that produces some execution logs, and sometimes people do some log parsing to do analysis on logs and try to understand what happened during the workflow execution. So they use that to do workflow characterizations, develop algorithms, and evaluation systems. So what we are proposing as part of the WorkflowHub is to, from these log parsers, create a common format so we could have these workflow traces. Then from these workflow traces, we can go directly input that into simulators that use external models to the evaluations and analysis of the systems and see how, for example, your algorithm is performing or how your workflow or your system or some functionality would perform in different platforms configurations. Another option to not be unlimited to the amount of traces, the real traces that you can collect, is to derive recipes of workflows, that these recipes can be used to generate synthetic workflows that are, even though they are synthetic, but they are still realistic because they resemble the structure, they have the same properties as the real workflow. And this allows you also to evaluate your algorithms, features, and so on larger, for example, workflows or slightly different configurations of the same workflow. Or for example, say you have more tasks, or you have more data footprint, you have more memory footprint, and so on. For that, we have developed a we call a common format. So it's an open source common JSON format that we can represent these collected workflow traces that I showed here in the previous slides. So the idea of this common format is that we can try to capture the essential aspects of the workflow executions. So here is a representation on this figure on the right side of the slide that shows you the high-level representation of this JSON file and what we capture. We capture some of the basic attributes like metadata, what is the name of the workflow, the description, when it was created, so when it was generated, what version of the schema are you using. We collect information about the workflow system that it runs, so the name of the system, the version of the system, and the URL, so where someone can find your workflow system and they could reuse it. We also collect the authors, information about the authors, metadata, so who generated this, so we can give the credits to the person who developed the workflow and ran the workflow. And the workflow itself, that is the main part used by the WorkflowHub to enable new research. So we collect the make span, when it was executed. We separate two interesting aspects here. One is the machine part. So the machine, we're going to collect information about the physical host that executed the workflow. For example, we collect the CPU speed, how much memory it has, how much disk space it has. If we can collect some network performance too, we're going to do it there. We also collected information about the jobs, and this is where it comes information on which input data is used, how much I/O is performed, what is the runtime of the job, what are the dependencies of the job, so what are the parents, their children, and then we can, with this information, we can build up the workflow structure. So this is an evolve representation that we start capturing, just the basic aspects. But as we evolve with the project, we plan to extend these with more requirements. So we not want to replace any other workflow language, for example, like the CWL one. The idea is really to have a format that we can collect as much information as possible about the workflow execution. So this can help to reconstruct new workflows, especially for the synthetic ones. So we really encourage contributions to the WorkflowHub using this format, because if you can contribute your traces using this format, it goes automatically into the next steps of the WorkflowHub that I'll be talking very soon. So one of the main aspects of having these traces is that we can create a collection of open access workflow traces that comes from production workflow systems and make it available to the community so anyone can benefit from that. And again, as I just said before, having this format helps the users to have a better idea of what is the representation, understanding the structure of the workflow and the requirements. So up to date, we have collected 101 traces from the Pegasus workflow system that we made all of them available on GitHub. And if you go to our workflowhub.org website, you have the links to the GitHub repositories there. So these traces comprise 6 different applications for 4 different domains, and we have data-intensive and compute-intensive tasks. These 101 traces, even though they do not capture all kinds of workflows, we argue that it's the data structures are sufficiently complex and heterogeneous, to show very different aspects of the workflow of current and also emerging large-scale execution models. And the good thing also, some of them, they consume and produce large volumes of data. They have thousands of tasks, as you can see. Some of the traces here have over 30,000 tasks of execution. So it gives you a very good aspect of how these workflows, the structure of these workflows behave and what is their dynamics. As part of the WorkflowHub project, we have created an open source Python package that facilitates some of the steps of our concepts. So that it takes the trace analysis and the generation of synthetic traces. So this Python package, as I said, is open source. Anyone can go there and do contributions. We expect you to be one of the new contributors for the WorkflowHub. And if we try to make it as simple as possible as for the installation. So you basically just need to do a pip install WorkflowHub and you're going to get the package installed. And the good thing about this analysis of these traces is because it can produce statistical summaries of workflow performance characteristics that can be used to generate syntactic traces. So here, for example, this is we use the Python package to use this package. So we analyze the traces and we try to fit probability distributions into the characteristics of the traces. And the idea behind that is to, when we wanted to generate syntactic traces that resembles the real ones, we wanted to be generating properties of the workflow execution that that resembles the original trace. And if you use probability distribution, it's a nice way so you can easily scale up the size of the workflows based on these distributions. So the current version of the Python package tried to use 23 different probability distributions provided as part of the SciPy's statistics submodel to automatically fit properties of the workflow traces to classify them and derive proper information from the distributions. For example, here we have two different runtimes from two different tasks of two different workflows. That one follows a skew norm distribution, and another one follows a triangular distribution. And what we generate at the end, actually, it's what we call these analysis summaries that provides, for example, this is one task here, these individual ones that it shows on the top right there. It says for the runtime, this is the minimum runtime it was observed. This is the maximum number of the runtime that was observed. This is the distribution that it fits. So in this case, the skew norm. And what are the parameters to initialize the distribution. So basically what you can do if you're trying to generate a workflow after you use this information is setting up the skew norm distribution with these parameters. You're going to generate things that is going to fit this behavior of a runtime. So one thing that is important here, we not only do distribution fit for runtime, but we do for individual types of files. And there are input or output files also for different requirements like memory requirements, energy requirements, and so on. So by using the traces and the analysis of the traces that generate the summaries, we use that summaries to create workflow recipes. So the idea of these workflow recipes is provides you all the necessary information to generate syntactic traces that are realistic. It means it resembles the actual tracing. So automatically here on the WorkflowHub in the Python package, there is these generators that we provide. Currently, we provide generations for 6 different applications, exactly the 6 applications that we provide traces for, the 101 traces I mentioned a few slides ago. And you can simply, in a Python package, is how to import the WorkflowHub generator, which recipes you wanted to use. And then you can just do from this recipe, I wanted to get generate my recipe based on the sum of the parameters that is required. For example, for the epigenomics would be the number of sequence files, the number of lines, the bin size, and so on. Or also you can provide for the number of chromosomes. Another thing that it's this is very way to generate really workflows that are exactly the same structure and the same behavior that the trace generate. It's just like with slight variations, because as you use probability distributions, you have a slight variation on that. Another option that we have is for generate from the number of tasks. Let's assume that one of these workflows have, that on the traces, they have a workflow with 1,000 tasks. But now you want to go further and say, what would happen if this workflow had 10,000 tasks, or if they had 50,000 or 100,000 tasks? So we also provide some Python functions here methods that you can call and say from num of tasks, and you tell how many tasks you want. And what the generator automatically is going to do for you is use all the information provided by that summaries and extrapolate the structure of the workflow to have the amount of tasks that you request for, keeping the same properties and behavior of the original tasks. The third aspect of the WorkflowHub is the part of the simulation. So one thing that is important to say is on WorkflowHub, we do not develop simulators. Instead, what we do is we catalog open source workflow system simulators. So if you go to our website, workflowhub.org, you're gonna, on the tab that is say the simulation part, you're gonna see a table that currently lists what open source simulators, workflow system simulators, currently are compatible with the WorkflowHub JSON format. That is the format that we represent the traces and also the syntactic traces. You can just go there, take one of these simulators, and use any tracing, and it's already 100% compatible. So one of the systems that provide simulations is called the Range Simulation Framework that was introduced 2 years ago in this exactly same workshop. And the idea of the Range is to make it easy to develop simulators of complex sub-infrastructure application executions. So if you have an infrastructure, for example, as the one platform you wanted to simulate as the one showed here on the bottom right, you have let's say some storage systems, you have a Slurm cluster here, you have other storage services around there, some file registry, some cloud computing service, everything connected by a one topology, and you also provide a network proximity service. There is a workflow system, and there's a science that I wanted to run some workflows. So the way that you can do that with Range is basically just using the building blocks for each of these systems put together and build up your own simulator. And you can extend doing your own scheduling algorithms or energy usage algorithms, cost algorithms, and any kind of basically research you want to do. So once you build up your simulator, use Range, and there are two that we already provide. That is the Pegasus one and the WorkQ one. What you can do is take any trace, real or synthetic, generated through WorkflowHub and run through Range and then get your results. What is nice about Range is because it's you have all the simulation abstractions that are ready. It's built on top of SyncGrid. So the SyncGrid project developed for now almost 20 years has been very well known for all the accurate and scalable models that they provide. And Range building on top of SyncGrid already benefits for all of these models. So if you wanted to learn more about Range, you can visit the website on range-project.org. Now I'm going to quickly walk you through a case study where we evaluated the accuracy of the syntactic traces with a simulator of a production workflow system. So in our previous work, and on the right side you have the figure of the previous site we have developed a workflow generator that has been used for several researchers. I could easily find over 30 research articles that has been enabled by these syntactic traces generated by this workflow generator. But there were some limitations with this generator because they only use two probability distributions to fit runtime and IO operations. So the problem is, even though some of the distributions looked quite good, but as you saw, we had our case using 23 different distributions to better characterize the workflow. So the next slides, I'm going to show some experiments and some comparison results and show how accurate the previous one was and the new one is. So for these experiments, we used the Range Pegasus simulator, as I mentioned before, onto the simulators page. It's a simulator developed using the Range framework that has been calibrated and it's accurate. So we're going to try to evaluate the accuracy and the scalability of these workflow traces. For the accuracy experiments, we took two workflows that were generated by the previous workflow generator and also is generated by the WorkflowHub. So we could make a fair comparison to see how they compare to each other and how accurate they are according to the structure of the workflow and the execution time, IO, and performance. So what we did is we took the genome workflow, epigenomics workflow, that is the one on the left-hand side, the results, and we took the montage one with different degrees, that is the one on the right-hand side. So for each workflow, we use different data sets, in this case, 6 different data sets for the epigenomics and 4 different data sets for the montage workflow. And for them, we plot the results. We use the Range Pegasus simulator to run all of them, and we use the traces there. So the solid line is the real execution, the trace generated by the real execution. The dashed almost dotted line is the synthetic one. So this one is generated with WorkflowHub. And the more dashed line are the ones generated by the previous workflow generator that we had. So if you look at just visually inspecting these graphs, you can see that the previous generator actually it's quite off of the charts when compared to the actual execution and the current one generated by WorkflowHub. And as we increase the number of tasks, actually, this second number here was the number of tasks into the workflow. We see that it's a huge discrepancy between what was the real execution, like this purple solid line here, the actual is the previous execution generated by the workflow generator, and the WorkflowHub gets much closer. There are still slight differences, and this is expected because since you are using probability distributions, not everything is exactly the same as before, but it's very similar. And the main thing when we inspected these differences here and we see the same things happening for montage, it's because of the workflow structure. The workflow structure actually on the previous generator wasn't strictly following the rules of how the workflow was structured, so it was a little bit derailing too much into the way that the workflow was generated, and that caused these discrepancies. And also the distributions, as they most use uniform or normal distributions. So some of the things that were like skew norm distributions, they just map it to a uniform distributions and got wrong like generations. So the second aspect of our evaluation is what happens if we start to scaling. So I was telling before, we could use the recipes to generate synthetic workflows that have much more tasks than the original ones. So what we did is we took the real executions here, for these are the results for the 6 applications that we have today in the WorkflowHub. We generated synthetic workflows with 1,000, 5, 10, 25, 50, and 100,000 tasks. And our main goal here was to study if the workflow structure would remain similar and would yield similar results. In general, and most of the graphs here you see, the results are very, very similar, except for the 1000 genome one, that when you have the real execution and the synthetic 1K, they are quite close, and these are very close because they have almost the same number of tasks here. And as you increase the number of tasks, it gets a little bit off this behavior. Everything is normalized, so it's easier to compare. This difference here, actually, we thought what was wrong in the beginning, but if you analyze into the details, it's because the workflow, the 1000 genome, spend most of its time doing analysis in the beginning here of the workflow, and at the end they have just 3 tasks. That is the end of the workflow itself. And as you increase the number of, and these 3 tasks are static, they're not augmenting with the number of the tasks of the workflow. So what happens if when you go to 100K, actually this behavior here becomes just a very small spot into this graph. So, but actually when you compare all of these, you do RMCs between the real and all the generated ones, the RMCs are very, very low. So they are quite realistic. So we can claim that the WorkflowHub really scale well while keeping the structure and behavior of the workflow. So what are the main takeaways of this talk? I want to let you know we have a new workflow generation system that we call the WorkflowHub, that provides workflow traces using a common format. That it's also that has a new workflow generator. There is a set of workflow simulators that are compatible with these formats, and we are welcome new contributions. And WorkflowHub is there. It's alive. There is a Python package. It's well maintained. And we just wait for the community to join us and contribute as many workflows as you can. So I'll be around for questions if you have, and I encourage you to go and look around at the website and don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions. Thank you.